that they gave up the lowest yards per rush to opponents at 3.3 yards per rush? This defense is better than people realize, and they're splitting work. So I think there are better options this week. For example, this is the video that none of us in the fantasy space want to make for you guys, because quite simply, we could end up looking like fools for making a video like this. But I'm going to tell you some players that could absolutely bust, destroy, kill your fantasy week in a negative way. Guys that have terrible matchups, and some people, just some people, might have a better option. Let's start. I'm already going to get some hate for this, with Brandon Ayuk versus the New York Jets. I would really love everybody watching this video just to take a second and hear me out. I understand that most people who have Brandon Ayuk have to start Brandon Ayuk, but we'll talk about some alternate names some of you might have on your roster. Now, there's a couple factors at play here. Number one, this matchup is terrible for Ayuk. This is terrible for the entire 49ers. Last year, New York gave up the fewest points to fantasy wide receivers on a points per game basis. On average, the Jets gave up just 17.4 PPR points per game. And that's not just to a wide receiver. That's 17 PPR points to the entire team receivers, right? So an entire wide receiver core was averaging 17 points per game against this Jets defense. They were the only defense to average under 20 points per game to opposing wide receivers. In 2023, they held Stephon Diggs to 4 catches for 27 yards in week 11. They held Nico Collins to 1 catch for 13 yards in week 14 with no Tank Dell. They held Terry McLaurin to 3 catches for 50 yards in week 16. The Jets defense was the definition of elite. Last year, there wasn't a single secondary that gave up fewer passing yards per game than these New York Jets. Guys, they only gave up 168 passing yards per game. That is like insanely elite. And by the way, total yards per game, they were second in the NFL as far as giving up the fewest in those categories. And the reason I am most concerned, let's talk about Sauce Gardner. That dude is a bad man. I do not want to see Sauce Gardner against any of my fantasy wide receivers. Last year, Sauce Gardner did not travel with the wide receiver one from the opposite team. What does that mean? That means he played on one side of the field, and that was it. However, this offseason, these Jets have been talking about moving Sauce Gardner all over the field to travel with the number one wide receiver. So if that happens, that could be a real problem, because last year, Sauce Gardner was the best cover corner in the NFL. At least according to PFF grades, he was the number one overall graded cover corner. It was him, then Jalen Johnson, and De'Aaron Bland. Now, if Ayuk is shadowed by Sauce, wouldn't it make more sense to use him as a decoy and get Kittle, Debo, CMC going? And by the way, if Sauce Gardner does not travel with Ayuk, they still have a top 15 cover corner in DJ Reed on the opposite side. It doesn't matter where you go, there are elite cover corners across the board. This defense is seriously nasty. And the other thing to consider here is Ayuk hasn't seen any action on any 49er field this entire offseason. Preseason games, scrimmages, camp, practices. He has not been out there, and I understand he already has chemistry with Brock Purdy. However, there could be some timing issues, and I don't want this to happen, guys. I have Ayuk in some leagues, but there's also a possibility of a hamstring injury if you're going to just rush him out there and put him on the field straight away, which might lead to them slowly working him in. Maybe he doesn't play 90% of the snaps. Maybe it's that 80%, that 10% less. Here's the reality. Most of you guys out there, just like myself, are going to have to start Ayuk and just hope that this offense can overcome the defense that they're facing, all right? For example, I'm in a position in the Flock League where I have Brandon Ayuk. Now, I'm not going to sit Brandon Ayuk for the other guys on my bench like Gus Edwards or Brian Robinson or Chuba Hubbard. So most of you are going to have to start him like me, but I'm trying to talk to the people out there maybe in smaller leagues who might have a better option. For example, some better options this week, in my opinion, Amari Cooper, Devonta Smith, Stephon Diggs, DJ Moore, Malik Neighbors. I think these are all better options this week than Brandon Ayuk. I love him season long. But is it fair to have some of these concerns? I mean, it feels like you got to start him. You got to start him. In most leagues, yes, but some of you might have a better option. I hope you hear where I'm coming from. I'll probably get roasted for it, whatever. The second group that I'm worried about this week is all of the Commander running backs. So Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler, they face the Tampa Bay Bucks. This is not a good matchup. I find it difficult to have any confidence in these guys in week one. First off, the Bucks gave up the third fewest points to fantasy running backs per game last year, and their rushing defense was one of the best in the NFL. They were fourth in rushing yards allowed per game at 93. Very low. They were sixth in opponents' yards per rush. So on average, the opponent averaged 3.8 yards per rush against them. Super inefficient because they're a damn good defense. And they gave up the fifth fewest points to opposing offenses. Vita Vea, that's a big dude. He does not play no games. That is one of the best run stoppers in the league right now. I love Jaden Daniels. I'm a Commanders fan. I love Jaden Daniels more than your average person. I think he's going to change this offense entirely. However, he is still a rookie quarterback, so we do need to have managed expectations, as more times than not, a rookie quarterback does not support a good fantasy football offense. Now, what I will say is you can beat these Bucks defensively, but typically that's done through the air. Last year, for example, they gave up the fifth most passing yards per game. So if the Commanders are thinking about how to beat this defense, maybe they do let Jaden go ahead and air it out early on. There's also some weather concerns with this game. I don't know, man. There's just too many concerns for me. I'd rather start names like Tony Pollard, Javonte Williams, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Jerome Ford, and Gus Edwards. All right, the third name that I am personally concerned to start here in week one, it is a rookie. That's Rome Odunze versus the Tennessee Titans. A lot of people probably drafted him in deeper leagues and they're starting him, and I get it if you feel like you have to. Technically, the Titans are a good matchup last year, right? They were ninth in points allowed to fantasy wide receivers. So in theory, it's a good matchup, right? Well, here's the problem. We have to think about what's changed from last year to this year. And this whole team changed, but certainly defensively they got better. Why? Because they traded for one of the best corners in the NFL in L'Jarius Sneed. So that's going to make this entire secondary better. It will take pressure off of every single player, even the defensive line, to just go out and be themselves. They also traded for Ernest Jones, the linebacker from the Rams, who was very good analytically in PFF's database last year. But more importantly, we have no idea what Rome Odunze's role will be from day one in this offense. The offensive coordinator there is Shane Waldron. Does that name sound familiar? It should, because last year he was the offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks, and he held JSN back significantly. JSN was not a player seeing 80, 90% of the snaps. He was, seeing around 59, 56, 44, 53% of the snaps in the first 4 weeks. So we have already seen Shane Waldron kind of bring rookies back before he lets them really explore this offense. And I understand Rome Odunze is a different player to JSN, but still Rome Odunze has to battle out with two alphas. DJ Moore, who last year averaged 8 targets per game. Keenan Allen last year, who averaged the most targets per game in the NFL at 11.5. So not only is Rome going to have to, figure it out as a rookie and get kind of in the rotation with this team, but he's also going to have to battle with some really, really alpha level receivers in the last couple years. So look, Keenan Allen at the time of recording this is dealing with a heel injury. If Keenan misses this game, you can start Rome. But if Keenan plays, I would rather start Chris Godwin. I'd rather start Christian Kirk, Keenan Allen, Brian Thomas Jr., Deontay Johnson, Tank Dell, T. Higgins, and I'd even rather start Josh Palmer. Is that crazy to say? I don't think it is. Josh Palmer's the number one over there. We know he's going to get targeted, all right? Okay, the fourth name that I'm a little bit hesitant to start this week, I'm a little bit concerned, it's a little shaky, is David Njoku versus the Dallas Cowboys. From the outside looking in, this looks like a pretty decent matchup, right? The Cowboys, one of the better offenses in the NFL. The Browns should have to throw the ball in a potential high-scoring affair. However, Dallas last year gave up the 5th fewest points to fantasy tight ends on a per-game basis. They gave up just 8 points per game in PPR. That's even less in a half PPR format. And while David Njoku did break out in 2023, he broke out without Deshaun Watson, his current starting quarterback. In fact, last year, without Deshaun Watson, Joe Flacco, right? He averaged over 15 points per game. With Deshaun Watson, he averaged just 9. This team also just traded for Jerry Jeudy, so now there's more target competition. So I've been the bad cop. Why don't I play good cop for a second? Well, because of David Njoku's breakout season last year, Deshaun Watson and this offense are going to make him a more important part of this receiving corps, right? Okay, so yeah, you could say that. You could also say, well, the Cowboys defense lost a couple names through free agency, so they're not as good of a defense. So you could say all of those things, The reality is, if you drafted David Njoku, you very unlikely have a better option than him. But I'm just telling you to lower your expectations. Here are some names that I'd rather start. Jake Ferguson on the opposite side of the ball. George Kittle, Evan Ingram, Kyle Pitts are all names I would rather start. All right, the last name we're going to talk about today is another group of running backs. That's the Cincinnati Bengal running back room with Chase Brown and Zach Moss. I don't really feel good about either of these names. I know Zach Moss was just named the starter, but let's talk about this. This might be surprising to people, okay? So let's get on the same page from the beginning. The Patriots are likely to be an awful team this year. However, I don't think many people realize how good they were against the run last year because they were pretty fantastic. Don't believe me? Last year, if you look at total yards allowed per game, they were 6th in the NFL. If you look at rushing yards allowed per game, they allowed the 3rd fewest. And add on top of that they gave up the lowest yards per rush to opponents at 3.3 yards per rush. This defense is better than people realize. Combine the fact that this is an underrated defense with the question marks around the usage of this backfield. Again, I know Zach Moss is a starter. I like Zach Moss, but Chase Brown is still going to have a role. Like, what could the outcome be if this defense is really good against the rush and they're splitting work? So I think there are better options this week. For example, Tony Pollard. All right, Javonte Williams, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Jerome Ford, and Gus Edwards. And to finish the video, I've got some honorable mentions of players that have really bad matchups, and I think some of you guys might have better options. Brock Purdy, for example, versus the New York Jets. We talked about how good that defense is. Well, they gave up the fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. They gave up the 3rd fewest points to fantasy quarterbacks. It was a death wish to play a player versus the Jets last year. Justin Herbert versus the Las Vegas Raiders. He's still coming back from this injury, so he might have limited mobility, and this offense might be more focused on the run game. Let's talk about Devin Singletary here. On the outside looking in, it might look like a good matchup, but Minnesota last year allowed just 3.8 yards per carry. Bad offense in New York, limited touchdown opportunities, probably not many explosive plays from the running back position. I think you guys might have better options. How about Jaylen Warren coming off a hamstring injury? How much work can they really give him coming off that injury? And Atlanta gave up the 3rd fewest points to fantasy running backs in 2023. And then they added Matthew Judon, one of the better edge rushers in the NFL for the last couple years. DeAndre Swift versus the Tennessee Titans. Last year, they allowed 3.8 yards per carry, and they just traded for Ernest Jones, who's a good linebacker that we talked about. And DeAndre Swift thrives on receiving work. But last year, Tennessee gave up just 26 receiving yards to running backs per game. How about George Pickens at Atlanta? Atlanta last year gave up the 5th fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. They got AJ Terrell. They got a really good secondary there. And then how about Deontay Johnson? If Marcus Lattimore plays, I'm a little concerned. If he misses this game with an injury, I'm less concerned, all right? But Marcus Lattimore last year was 2nd in breakups, and he was 5th in man coverage rate. So those are some names that I'm concerned about starting. I understand that most of you guys are going to have to start these players. In fact, I'm just going to say right here, right now, and this is a time code I'm going to send to people. Look at me. I get it. If you have Ayuk, you probably have to start Ayuk. I am just talking to the people out there who just might have a better option. I'm trying to help people. I don't want to make this video. I know I'm going to get clowned on some of these takes. I know I'm going to get some of them wrong, but I'm trying to be bold. I'm trying to be helpful. I'm trying to give you good information. And ultimately, you got to set your lineup. You got to put your big boy pants on. All right. And make a decision. But I appreciate y'all for watching the video. Hey, if you want consistent rankings week in and week out, then use the promo code LAND, become a Mother Flocker member over on the Flock Fantasy website. You'll get my weekly rankings, premium tools, articles, databases, and more. You get a 7-day free trial if you use the promo code LAND. All right, go win this week. Subscribe if you like the content, like the video, and I'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.